December 18th, 1944. Somewhere outside Bastogne, Belgium. The cold had teeth. Not the kind that nips at your ears, the kind that sinks into your bones and refuses to let go. Private First Class Marcus Holloway stood beside his Sherman tank, C-14, nicknamed Iron Prayer, staring at what the rest of his crew called an embarrassment. Welded to the front glacis plate, the sides of the hull, and draped across portions of the turret were thin sheets of corrugated metal, salvaged roofing tin from a bombed-out Belgian barn. Strips of it bent and overlapping like fish scales, fastened with whatever bolts, wire, and spot welds Marcus could scrounge from the battalion workshop. It looked ridiculous. Holloway's tinfoil fortress, the loader had called it. Like wrapping a Sherman in a damn cookie tin, the driver muttered. Even Lieutenant Barnes, their tank commander, had shaken his head. That's not going to stop a Panzerfaust, Holloway. Hell, it won't stop a rifle round. But Marcus didn't argue. He just kept welding, because Marcus Holloway understood something the others didn't. Something he'd learned back home in Cleveland, working summers at his uncle's metal fabrication shop. It wasn't about stopping the round. It was about confusing it. 48 hours later, a German Panzerschreck rocket would scream out of the fog, strike the front of C-14 at point-blank range, and something impossible would happen. The crew would walk away, every single one of them, and no one would laugh at tin plate armor ever again. Before the war, Marcus Holloway was the kid who fixed things. Not just fixed them, understood them. While other boys in the neighborhood were playing stickball or sneaking into movie matinees, Marcus was in his uncle's workshop watching metal bend, learning how heat changed steel, studying how a rivet could hold or fail depending on the angle of stress. His uncle, Frank Holloway, ran a small metal fabrication business on the east side of Cleveland. They made everything from industrial grates to decorative ironwork for wealthy homes. Marcus started sweeping floors at age 12. By 15, he was operating the press brake. By 17, he could weld cleaner seams than men twice his age. But it wasn't just skill. Marcus had a gift for seeing how things worked, or didn't work. He could look at a joint and know it would fail. He could eyeball a load-bearing beam and calculate whether it would hold. His uncle called it metal sense. His mother called it overthinking everything. When Pearl Harbor was bombed in December 1941, Marcus was 19 and working full-time at the shop. He enlisted in January 1942, not out of patriotic fervor, but because he felt he had to. His older brother had joined the Navy. His father had served in the First War. It was just what you did. The Army assigned him to armor. Not as a tanker at first, but as a mechanic with the Ordnance Department. He spent nearly a year stateside, learning how to repair and maintain the M4 Sherman tank, the backbone of American armored forces. He learned its weak points, its strengths, its fatal flaws. And by the time he shipped out to Europe in the summer of 1944, Marcus knew one thing for certain. The Sherman was a death trap. The M4 Sherman was a marvel of mass production. Over 49,000 were built during the war. It was reliable, easy to repair, and could be produced faster than any tank in history, but it had a problem. Everyone whispered about, and no one wanted to say out loud. It burned. German tank crews called it the Tommy Cooker. American soldiers had darker names for it. When a Sherman was hit by an anti-tank round, especially from the German 75mm or 88mm guns, it didn't just get disabled. It ignited. The ammunition stored in the sponsons, the fuel in the engine, the hydraulic fluid, all of it turned the tank into an inferno within seconds. Crews had a grim saying, "First one's free, second one you burn." Marcus had seen it happen, in Normandy, in the Bocage, Shermans brewing up, black smoke pouring from the hatches, and if you were lucky, maybe 2 guys made it out. Maybe. By late 1944, the Army had introduced wet stowage, ammunition racks surrounded by water glycol jackets to prevent fires. It helped, but it didn't solve the bigger problem. The Sherman's armor was thin. Too thin. The frontal glacis plate was 63.5 millimeters, sloped at 47 degrees, effective against most threats if you were lucky. But the sides? Only 38 millimeters. A Panzerfaust or Panzerschreck, German infantry anti-tank weapons, could punch through that like tissue paper. And in the cramped streets of Belgian towns, in the dense forests of the Ardennes, German infantry didn't need tanks to kill you. They just needed to get close. Tank crews tried everything. Sandbags, spare track links welded to the hull, logs, concrete. Some units even scavenged armor plates from knocked-out German tanks and welded them onto their Shermans. General Patton himself had banned sandbags after tests showed they added weight without real protection, but crews kept using them anyway, anything to feel safer. Marcus watched it all, and he thought about angles.
It started in mid-December, during a maintenance halt outside a small village whose name Marcus never learned. C-14 had taken a glancing hit from an 88mm round 2 days earlier. The shell had struck the upper glacis plate at an oblique angle and ricocheted off, leaving a deep gouge but no penetration. Marcus stood there, staring at the scar in the metal, running his fingers over the groove. The round hadn't gone through because of the angle. The armor's slope had deflected it just enough. That's when the idea hit him. What if you could create more angles? Not thicker armor, just more surfaces for a round to hit before it reached the main hull. Layers, spacing, confusion. He'd seen it before, back at his uncle's shop. When you wanted to deaden sound or prevent vibration, you didn't use one thick plate. You used multiple thin plates with air gaps. The energy dispersed across the layers instead of transferring straight through. Could the same principle work with shaped charge weapons like the Panzerfaust? Marcus knew the Panzerfaust used a hollow charge warhead. When it detonated, it created a superheated jet of copper that burned through armor. But the jet needed distance to form properly. If you could disrupt it early, make it detonate prematurely, or scatter its energy, you might survive. He explained it to his crew one night over cold rations. "So you want to wrap the tank in tin?" the loader, a wiry kid from Georgia named Eddie Klein, said with a smirk. Not wrap. Layer. Create standoff distance. The Panzerfaust detonates on contact. If it hits something 6 inches before the hull, the shaped charge loses effectiveness. The driver, Corporal Jimmy Reeves, shook his head. That's insane, Holloway. You're talking about barn roofing. I'm talking about physics. Lieutenant Barnes, their tank commander, just sighed. You really think this will work? I think it's better than nothing. Barnes looked at the rest of the crew, then back at Marcus. Fine. But if this gets us killed, I'm haunting you. Finding the materials was the easy part. War leaves debris everywhere. Marcus scrounged corrugated metal roofing from a collapsed barn, thin steel sheeting from a destroyed German half-track, and lengths of angle iron from a bombed-out factory. He requisitioned welding rods from the battalion supply sergeant, who thought he was crazy but signed the paperwork anyway. The hard part was the installation. Marcus worked mostly at night, using a portable welding rig powered by the tank's auxiliary generator. He cut the tin into overlapping strips and mounted them 6 inches out from the hull using brackets made from scrap iron. The spacing was critical. Too close and the standoff wouldn't work. Too far and the whole assembly would catch on debris. He covered the front glacis plate first, then the sides, then portions of the turret. The metal didn't cover everything. It couldn't. But it created a patchwork outer shell that stood off from the main armor like a second skin. It looked awful. Other tank crews passing by would stop and stare. Some laughed. Some just shook their heads. One sergeant from another platoon called it Holloway's hillbilly upgrade. Eddie, the loader, tried to be supportive. I mean, it's creative. Jimmy, the driver, was less kind. We look like a garbage truck mated with a barn. Even Lieutenant Barnes seemed embarrassed. Holloway, if the brass sees this, they're going to think we've lost our minds. But Marcus kept working. He reinforced the welds. He added extra brackets. He even angled some of the plates to create deliberate deflection surfaces. And on December 17th, as German forces launched their massive counteroffensive through the Ardennes, what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, C-14 was ordered forward into the chaos. No one was laughing anymore. The morning of December 18th came gray and bitter. Fog hung so thick you couldn't see 20 yards. C-14 was part of a small task force sent to hold a crossroads outside Bastogne, a critical junction the Germans needed to advance. The convoy moved slowly, grinding through snow and mud. Visibility was near zero. Every shadow could be an enemy. Every sound could be the prelude to an ambush. They reached the crossroads just after dawn. Lieutenant Barnes positioned C-14 hull down behind a low stone wall covering the main approach. 2 other Shermans took positions on the flanks. Infantry dug in along the tree line. Then they waited. The Germans came at midday. Not with tanks. Those were bogged down elsewhere, but with infantry, lots of infantry. Panzer grenadiers, supported by machine guns and Panzerschrecks. The first Marcus knew of the attack was the sound of small arms fire crackling through the fog. then the distinctive crack of a Panzerschreck launching. "Incoming!" someone screamed over the radio. The rocket came out of the mist like a meteor, a dark streak trailing smoke. Marcus, sitting in the bow gunner's position, saw it for maybe half a second before it hit. The world exploded. The impact was deafening. The entire tank shuddered. Smoke and fire erupted across the front glacis plate. Marcus was thrown against his seat, his vision whiting out, his ears ringing. For a moment, he thought he was dead. Then he realized he could still breathe. "Report!" Lieutenant Barnes was shouting. "Everyone report! Driver, okay! Loader, okay! Gunner, okay! Bow gunner, I'm okay!" But how? Marcus looked through his periscope. The front of the tank was scorched black. The outer layer of tin plating was shredded, hanging in twisted strips. But beneath it, the main armor was intact, scarred, dented, but intact. The Panzerschreck round had struck one of the corrugated metal panels. The shaped charge had detonated prematurely, 6 inches out from the hull, just like Marcus had calculated. The jet of molten copper had dispersed across the standoff gap, losing most of its penetrating power before it reached the real armor. The tin plate armor had worked. "Holy hell," Jimmy whispered. "Holloway, your crazy junk just saved our lives!" Lieutenant Barnes keyed the radio. "C-14 still operational. Engaging!" The turret swung left. The 75mm roared. The Germans fell back into the fog. And Marcus Holloway, the kid from Cleveland who understood angles, exhaled for what felt like the first time in minutes.
The battle at the crossroads lasted 3 more hours. C-14 took 2 more hits. One glancing shot from a Panzerfaust that struck the side skirt, and another that hit the turret but failed to penetrate. Each time, the improvised armor absorbed or deflected enough energy to keep the crew alive. When the Germans finally withdrew, Lieutenant Barnes ordered the crew to dismount and inspect the damage. The tank looked like it had been through a meat grinder. The outer layer of tin was shredded, scorched and barely hanging on, but the hull beneath was intact. Dented, yes, scarred, absolutely, but whole. Word spread fast. By that evening, other tank commanders were asking Marcus how he'd done it. By the next morning, crews from 3 other platoons were scavenging materials to replicate his design. Even the battalion commander, a gruff major named Kellerman, came by to inspect C-14 personally. "This," he said, running his hand over the battered tin plating, "is the ugliest damn thing I've ever seen on a tank." Marcus braced for the reprimand. "But it works," Kellerman continued. "How many hits did you take?" "3 direct, sir. All Panzerschrecks." "And your crew?" "All present, sir." Kellerman nodded slowly. "Permission granted for any crew in this battalion to modify their tanks using similar methods. I'll send a memo to division. They won't like it, but I don't give a damn." He turned to leave, then paused. "Good work, Private. You just saved a lot of lives." Marcus didn't know what to say, so he just saluted. Over the next 2 weeks, as the Battle of the Bulge raged across the Ardennes, more than a dozen Shermans in Marcus's battalion were modified with improvised standoff armor. Not all of them used tin plating. Some used wooden planks, others used spare track links mounted on brackets, and a few even used scavenged German armor plates. The principle was the same: create space between the outer surface and the hull. Give shape-charge weapons something to detonate against before they reach the crew. It didn't make the Shermans invincible. Armor-piercing rounds from German tank guns still punched through. Direct hits from 88mm artillery still destroyed tanks. But against infantry anti-tank weapons, the Panzerfaust and Panzerschreck that killed so many Shermans in close combat, the improvised armor made a difference. Casualty rates dropped. Crew confidence rose. Tanks that might have been destroyed stayed in the fight. And Marcus Holloway, the quiet kid who saw angles, became something of a legend in his battalion. Not the loud, chest-thumping kind of legend, the quiet kind. The kind where men nod when you walk by. The kind where your name gets mentioned in after-action reports. The kind that matters. After the Battle of the Bulge ended in late January 1945, Marcus was promoted to corporal and transferred to a maintenance company, where his skills could be put to broader use. He spent the rest of the war helping other units modify their vehicles, not just tanks, but half-tracks, jeeps, anything that needed protection. He never sought recognition. When a Stars and Stripes reporter came around asking about the soldier who reinvented tank armor, Marcus deflected, saying it was just common sense. But the men he served with knew better. When the war ended, Marcus returned to Cleveland. He went back to his uncle's shop, back to bending metal and making things fit. He married a schoolteacher named Dorothy, had 3 kids, and lived a quiet life. He never talked much about the war. When people asked, he'd shrug and say, "I fixed tanks." But every now and then, one of his kids would find him in the garage, staring at a piece of corrugated metal, running his fingers over the ridges, like he was reading Braille. "Dad, what are you thinking about?" they'd ask. And he'd smile. Just a little. Angles. Marcus Holloway's story isn't about heroism in the traditional sense. It's not about charging into battle or single-handedly defeating the enemy. It's about something quieter, but no less important. The refusal to accept that this is just how things are. The Sherman had problems. Everyone knew it. But most people just accepted it and tried to survive. Marcus didn't. He looked at the problem, thought about it from a different angle, and came up with a solution no one else had considered. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't pretty, but it worked. And that's the real lesson here. Innovation doesn't always come from engineers in labs or generals in war rooms. Sometimes it comes from a kid from Cleveland who spent his summers learning how metal bends, and who refused to let his friends die if there was something, anything, he could do about it. So here's the question. What problem are you looking at right now and accepting as unchangeable? What tin plate armor idea have you dismissed because it seems too simple, too ugly, too unconventional? Because sometimes the best solutions don't come from doing things the way they've always been done. They come from seeing the problem from a different angle. Leave a comment below. Have you ever had an idea that others dismissed as stupid but turned out to work? We'd love to hear your story. Subscribe for more untold World War II stories that reveal the human ingenuity behind history's greatest moments.